Welcome to Wine Line. This is your host, Robert Scott, and this morning we're very excited to have an old friend and a new friend with us today, leading this discussion today. And this is, let me say, this is a first effort where we're bringing in different people from different locations in the country and funneling everything through Skype, so fingers crossed. And today, our traveling reporter and wine concierge, David Fuhrer, will be talking with Patrick McGovern. Dr. Patrick McGovern is the scientific director of the Biomolecular Archaeology Project for Cuisine, Fermented Beverages, and Health at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia. Gentlemen, happy to have you with us this morning. David, take it away.
Thank you, Robert. And thanks for this great opportunity to interview one of my favorite interview subjects over many years of conducting interviews, Dr. Pat, whom I first met when residing in London several years ago. He was instrumental in stimulating my already nascent interest in finding out what was going on with wine in the past. And I don't mean 10 or 20 years ago. I mean thousands of years ago. And it got me traveling a whole lot more. Cut to a decade or so later, I got inspired to create a couple events that occurred in San Francisco and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., entitled Origins of Wine Civilization, with Dr. Pat as my keynote speaker at both. Hopefully, fingers crossed, this is going to continue to bigger cities on both sides of the Atlantic. But on to Dr. Pat and what he is noted for. He is an author of many things. Most recently, a book on ancient beers. He co-authored with Dogfish Head Brewery's Sam Calagione. Excuse the pronunciation, Sam. However, today we're talking about wine. Pat, you're known as the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, wines, and extreme beverages. What do you consider extreme beverages?
Well, David, it's good to hear your voice again and to meet Robert and get involved in this discussion this morning. The idea of extreme fermented beverages, actually, it does. The recent book I published on ancient brews, brews was sort of chosen by the publisher, but it really doesn't refer just to beers. I mean, it really is extreme fermented beverages or hybrid beverages that are discussed in this book. So there's a lot of discussion actually about wine as well as beer and mead and herbs that go in to an extreme beverage. So an extreme beverage is really a mixed beverage of all different ingredients. And it probably goes right back to the beginning of Homo sapiens, Homo imbibiens, we could say, drinking human, and millions of years ago, and as they tried to figure out how fermentation worked and used all different ingredients from their environment.
Yeah, please continue.
So that would have started out in Africa, say 4 million years ago, and as hominins and then humans, experimented with all the different natural products that are found in Africa.
You've also done some interesting work with regards to Neolithic discoveries in China as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I mean both Neolithic beverages, which is the first period in which we have permanently settled villages that are able to then process grains, develop different fruits, for wines and so forth. So China, on each side of Asia, really, we have Neolithic developments occurring about the same time. So in China, the earliest fermented beverage we ever identified chemically is from the early Neolithic site of Jiahu in the Yellow River Valley. And we did a recreation of that with Dogfish Head Brewery, I think in 2006. It won a gold award at the Great American Beer Festival, and I was given the gold medal, which I brought back with me. I mean, Sam had already gotten many gold medals for Midas Touch, which is, very similar in some ways to the Jiahu beverage. And so I set up a little shrine in my office lab in which I have the sherds that we analyzed from Jiahu, the gold medal, the bottle with a very provocative label on it, showing a young woman with the sign of an alcoholic beverage in Chinese script on her back, tattooed. And so every morning when I come in, like even this morning, I came in, I bowed down to my shrine, and asked for help during the day.
Well, Pat, that gold medal was well-deserved. I had the pleasure of having Jiahu on a couple of occasions, enjoyed it tremendously. Can you please briefly explain the field of molecular archaeology in which you specialize?
Okay, so it sounds a little bit ominous, I suppose, for the chemically challenged among us, but really, it's pretty straightforward in that we used advanced chemical techniques, things like liquid chromatography, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, infrared spectrometry, and so forth, to analyze ancient residues. Now, the residues may be visible, like they were for the Midas tomb in Turkey, that we can extract ancient organics out of with solvents like methanol or chloroform, or they can be invisible, in which we generally would take a sample of the pottery, which has absorbed the liquid, near the bottom, where you get some settling out of materials and so forth. And then, even though you can't see an actual physical residue, it's been absorbed into the clay structure and held there for thousands of years. So then we do the same thing. We boil it up in methanol, chloroform, evaporate off the solvents, and then we have a solid material that we can start doing these analyses on. So it's really a series of methods to reconstruct the original ingredients in ancient foods and beverages, dyes. I did a lot of work on royal purple dye, for instance, of the Phoenicians.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. So what is it in humans causing us to seek out the past to understand what wine is today? I mean, what's to be gained and what's to be learned from turning backwards rather than looking forwards?
Well, I think especially with grape wine, I mean, it's very specific. I mean, we talk about terroir, we talk about aging of wine. So already the wine connoisseur is sort of tuned in to the idea of history, and they've done surveys in California, for instance, in which they asked wine drinkers, what they'd like to hear more about, and history really is right at the top of that list. And so we would like to know where the grapes came from, how the winemaking techniques developed, how they are being affected by modern approaches, and really what goes into making a wine both today and in the past, and taking as much as all the good information that we can from the past and applying it to the present.
Fair enough. So tangential to that, in what manner has the structure of commerce, as it occurred centuries past, worked its influence through to today's current trade of wine?
Well, I think this is really a very important question because we have what's called the wine culture in the Middle East, going back to the Neolithic period and maybe even earlier, Upper Paleolithic, in which we have domestication of the grapevine. We have the methods worked out of how to do viticulture, the pottery vessels being invented that are going to be used to process, store, serve the beverage. So you've really got a wine culture that is really centered around social structure, religion. We see this today in our Western religions. I mean, the Eucharist has grape wine. Many Jewish ceremonies have so many cups of wine at the Passover, marriage, and so forth. Even Islam, in the paradise that will come, you have unlimited quantities of grape wine that you can enjoy. So this wine culture became very central, too, to the political structure. So if you were a king, let's say, up in Georgia or somewhere in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and you wanted to make an impression on an Egyptian pharaoh or king, you would send presents of wine vessels, and even the actual wine could be exported. in jars with stoppers and often with tree resin to help preserve it, both overland and by sea. And then you would effectively be transferring that wine culture to another place. And then the recipients, they eventually would figure out they could plant their own vineyards, like in the Nile Delta. And so the wine culture has just spread its tentacles basically around the world, starting back in the Neolithic period and onwards. And it's, first went to Tigris, Euphrates valleys, down into Egypt, across the Mediterranean to Italy, Spain, and then, eventually France, and made its way, more recently to the New World. So it's a great story of commerce and, the power of this commodity, which has all kinds of medicinal, religious, social, economic ramifications.
Yeah, I reckon that viticulture, possibly more than any other form of agriculture, has engendered cultural shifts in greater numbers and greater capacity as well.
I think it's very interesting that today there are a number of wineries that are really not only looking backwards to the past, but are employing some ancient methods to produce wine and using vessels such as amphora again.
Exactly. I mean, that is something I've been calling for, ever since I started working in Georgia back in the late 1990s, is that because they, perpetuated that tradition of Cuevres or Pithoi or amphora winemaking underground, what would be the effect of making your wine in a ceramic material? Now, people use concrete, egg-shaped vessels. Well, that's a ceramic. But why not, do more experimentation than with pottery vessels, either above ground or below ground? Like above ground, Canaanite jar or amphora is generally shown in the Egyptian reliefs and frescoes as being above ground. And then we've got the instance in Armenia recently of definitely there being karas, underground large jars being used for winemaking, and then that tradition was perpetuated, in Georgia especially. So we'd like to know more about what the actual effect of pottery is on winemaking, and that's a work in progress. I mean, it's some people have done experimentation on, how pottery itself, fired clay affects the fermentation process and, different compounds that are formed and so on. But it's been very limited so far. And so, like the last time I was over in France, in Bordeaux, I went to the Wine Institute there, and we've initiated a project to try to work on that more. Looking at the sensory elements especially, and then we'd have to, play around with different kinds of clays from different areas. This is, all part of the terroir, you could say. And, think about the oxidation reduction, all the chemical reactions that are occurring, enzymatic and so forth, that might have impacts on, how the final wine tastes. And I guess David, he knows all about Cuevre wine, and he can probably comment on, what it tastes like, I suppose.
They're varying iterations. I'm not going to weigh in with my opinion of that at this point. However, do you think that anybody's experimenting with the method of vinification that preceded the use of clay, carved out tree logs?
Well, no, I don't know of anybody working on that. I mean, for grains and for roots and tubers and so forth that are carbohydrates, you've got the chew and spit method. You don't need that for grapes. You just or any fruit. You just press it out, get the juice, and
sure.
There's always yeast, associated with it that will cause the fermentation.
You have more enzymatic interaction as well when spit is involved, I suppose.
That's the whole idea. We've got this enzyme, an amylase or ptyalin in our saliva that breaks down carbohydrates into sugar.
I received a video from a friend in Bordeaux a couple weeks ago, and it showed one of the wineries there on the right bank had taken his production, or a good deal of his production, in bottle and was burying. They excavated a large trough, laid all the bottles down, and buried them. And they're going to let them cure in bottle for underground for a period of time. And I guess maybe when I'm over there next couple of weeks, I'll get to taste one.
Well, I mean, that's the basic idea about having a wine cellar, I suppose, or a cave, like if, for instance, in the site on the West Bank called Gibeon, which is mentioned in the Bible, is where the sun stood still. They found numerous limestone caves that had many amphoras in them with thousands of liters of wine, and they were all at the perfect storage temperature. So I don't know what the storage temperature on the right bank is for aging wine. But if it's, I suppose, what is it, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever. But anyway, these
Patrick, what do you make of the latest notable reported discovery concerning ancient wine that was reported last month in what's now Israel?
Wine or beer?
I believe it was wine that was reported upon last year in Israel.
I mean, there's the one up at Cabri in the Galilee area where they have a storage facility with large jars that, they've done some analyses on, and they appear to be wine. But the most recent discovery is the one in the Carmel range in a cave in which they had what appear to be Upper Paleolithic or Natufian stone containers that still had starch in them that they identified as barley, wheat that had undergone fermentation and maybe malting and mashing. So I've been dealing with that for the last week or so. but I mean, I think for the Paleolithic in general, fruit and honey are the most, the easiest materials to ferment because, I mean, like you can squash out the fruit and get juice that will ferment. And honey, you can dilute it down to make with water, and then there's yeast in the honey that will start the fermentation, and you get meat. So, but that could go back extremely early, in the Paleolithic.
What is a noteworthy example of how ancient cultures grew from the exchange of knowledge and experience gained in the development of the vine? I mean, this harkens back to our earlier stream of conversation. But what examples would you get, please?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to look at, say, the Egyptian illustrations of winemaking, which go back to almost 3000 BC, which show a really detailed understanding of viticulture. They have the vines probably being irrigated up in the delta. They have small containers in which the vines are growing out of up onto a pergola, and then that protects the grapes from the sun. If you have a canopy like that. And then it's also easy to pick the grapes, so they show the humans out picking them, and then they have the stomping method in which you get into a limestone basin, not too large, with a few other people. Sort of like on the making port wine, which I've had the pleasure of doing the stomping out of the grapes, and
in the open lagarish,
right. And the advantage there is the human foot is very well contoured, so it doesn't crush the seeds, so you don't get that tannic property being conveyed.
The PSI of our feet and the
right,
and the relative squishiness by comparison to a hard press certainly makes for a gentler extraction of the polyphenols.
Right. So then the seeds come to the surface, and you just scoop them off, and you've got a nice wine. But the grape juice, and then is seen usually as a red liquid pouring out of these presses, and then they have the pottery jars. I mean, they had to invent pottery, and I think one of the prime motivations of inventing pottery was probably to be able to process, store, and serve different fermented beverages, including wine. And so those could then be stoppered. So, if, the big issue, which, Pliny the Elder talks about and says is the greatest effort that has been put in by humankind is to keep wine from going to vinegar. So how do you do that? Well, they took clay and they made stoppers, and they added tree resins that have antioxidant properties. The tree resins aren't shown in those early winemaking scenes, but certainly the stoppers are, and they would, have a label. So you have the earliest wine labels, telling you, what part of the Nile Delta it came from, what year of which king, and then usually some sort of qualitative assessment of the wine, whether it's good, or very, very good. So not a real detailed explanation, but still, the information you need to figure out if it's an aged wine and what have you.
And that would have a direct benefit to commerce as well, establishing how the wine was traded,
yes,
as well, from whom it came and how it got from point A to point B.
Right.
What links may be made between fermented grapes and grains? What corresponding values do they have, and how may this impact our understanding of them separately or in combination?
Well, I think they both have their place. Depending on where you're living, you may have the ability to make more grains or gather more manioc in the jungle or whatever, more chocolate fruit that you can use as a base for a wine, or you may be up in the hill country where the Vitis vinifera grew in the Middle East. I mean, so 99% of the wine that we drink, grape wine, is derived from Vitis vinifera sylvestris, the wild form, or vinifera, which is the domesticated form, which starts out in the Middle East. Now, it also occurs, across, the Danube and, up into Europe. But as far as we know, the original domestication occurred in the Middle East. And so, there you have the starting point, for that particular plant. And so every locale is going to have its own preferred plant that can make a fermented beverage. Whether it's in Mesopotamia and Egypt, generally it was a barley wheat beer and in the upland country where the grapevine grows very well in the Middle East, it was the grape.
Is there any evidence to suggest that Vitis vinifera sylvestris was joined by other grape varieties in its origin state, or was there travel not happening in both directions to accommodate that?
Well, we don't have any evidence yet, across Central Asia or in the Middle East of anything other than Vitis vinifera being in the Middle East. Now, if you go over to China, they have like 40 different species of grape, none of which apparently was ever domesticated, but, archaeological exploration and genetic studies, may change the picture here, because some of those vines in China particularly are very sweet and aromatic, and they still people. I've been to places in China where the local people are out collecting the wild grapes and making wine from it. I've tasted it, and it comes out pretty well. So the fact that we had the evidence from Jiahu of a wine made from grape, wild grape, presumably Chinese, and or hawthorn tree fruit, shows that they were already experimenting with that, with using grapes, to make wine. But we don't know if there was ever any movement, of those species in China to anywhere else. So whereas with Vitis vinifera, once it gets domesticated, they start transplanting it to all different locations, down into Mesopotamia, Egypt, across the Mediterranean. So all you need is a cutting of the vine, to transplant it. Yeah,
it makes me curious as to the reasons why grains ended up being favored over grapes in China. If indeed the original grapes in China you're referring to are as sweet and aromatic as you say, then I'm curious why viticulture never really took hold in China. But that's maybe
it's for a future investigation.
Yes, exactly.
But they learned how to, they developed really very advanced, mold fermentation or saccharification systems, with all different herbs and so forth. So they developed a very sophisticated system of how to take a grain like rice or sorghum or millet and make it into a fermented beverage. And, that may have just, like if we go back to the Shang Dynasty, there's like 5 or 6 different fermented beverages mentioned, one of which seems to be a fruit or herbal wine of some sort, and then the others seem to be made from rice. So, fruit is there even in the Shang Dynasty going back to 1500 BC. It's just that it never really took hold for some reason, as far as we know.
We were speaking earlier of alternate vessels such as clay jars being used for making wines. As far as your research has indicated, what inherent strengths and weaknesses may arise from these later developments that we're seeing, or is the evidence too soon to come to a conclusion about?
What later developments do you mean?
Well, the fact that people are making more natural wines using more alternate vessels, etc. And there's been a rise of exportation of wines currently being made in the Caucasus from Georgia and Armenia to around the world. So there's been a kind of a uptick for people who are keen to know about wine, about the enjoyment and the interest in wines from the Caucasus and all that. So right. And some of these are being made in alternate vessels, some are not, and the use of alternate vessels has reemerged. In many places, Spain, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, and here in the Americas as well. Do you see this as a rebirth of the past, or are winemakers looking to create something new and all that? Given your knowledge and given your fame in this niche, I would think that people are constantly approaching you with their samples, saying, "What do you think? Where am I going here?"
Yeah, I could wish for more tastings, but like I remember when I first got involved in analyzing some early wine, and I pointed out the tree resins being added. As not just like Retsina. I mean, Greece is the only place that really carries on this tradition, and even they've sort of moved away from it. But that it was very common throughout antiquity, and so when I was quoted in some popular articles, some of the California winemakers thought I was sort of putting down the whole idea of a tree resin. Well, I wasn't, because I traveled in Greece and I loved Retsina, and especially if you're looking out over the Aegean and you've got your moussaka, your
we've all had our Retsina moments.
Yeah. So, then I said, well, if you're so interested in this subject of adding a tree resin, you use oak barrels. I mean, that's essentially adding a tree resin. Why not take it a step further? Add some pine resin, add some terebinth resin. So I only got one taker at that point. Only one California winemaker was willing to take a chance on this, Sean Thackeray.
Yeah, he would.
Yeah, and I got some pine resin from Mexico for him, but then he never produced it either. I think there was a problem. His warehouse in San Francisco, where he stored his wines, was burned at one point, and that kind of slowed down the progress on that. But I think that, the current trend is just like in the craft brewing or craft distilling revolutions that are occurring, is that people want other flavors. They want to see what's possible, and they can take some of their clues from the past, and then they can take other clues from the present, and try out different combinations of ingredients. And really, we're just at the beginning, I suppose, of a whole change in what wines are being produced. Because my vision, I guess, like I point out in Ancient Brews, is that you do these extreme beverages in antiquity, so why not do them today? And the wine people, are very reluctant to do that. They want to stick with just grapes alone. But that wasn't the case in antiquity. Wines were mixed with lots of different things.
Years ago, I came across the first example of people blending wine with beer in, of all places, Luxembourg, and it met with surprising success. I believe it's still in production today. That goes back to, I believe, 2006 7 with Mark Gallis of his eponymous winery started making a combination beer and sparkling wine, and it was delicious. And he made several versions. I'm not sure if it's still in existence. But it's missed opportunities. I've scratched my head. Why don't do more of that?
I mean, that's why when we first got the recipe, quote quote, for Midas, the Midas beverage, that was served at the funerary feast in 700 BC at the capital in Turkey. It came out a combination of wine, beer, and mead, and we thought to ourselves, when do you ever mix wine and beer together? Because at that point we didn't know about the ancient tradition. And then as you start digging back through the Middle Ages, go back to our chemical analysis, it turns out that was a pretty common thing to do.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. There's again, it's precious little of that being made, and often it's being made from the beer perspective, meaning it's projects that are initiated by people such as Sam Calagione and yourself. And as an addendum to what is happening with beer, I rarely, again, the only example I know for certain is Mark Gallis in Luxembourg of a winery initiating these sort of projects.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I have to look into that more because, especially sparkling wine, because then it gets you into the question of the extent of carbonation. Indeed. That could have been available even in antiquity. In fact, after I get off the phone with you, I'm going to talk to somebody from Science Friday, the NPR program,
sure,
about the origins of alcohol and the word. And I'm going to do that. But then I have another woman writing a book on sparkling wine, Catherine Cole. And
I know her. She's up in Oregon. Yep.
Yep. And so she wrote a book on rosé wine, mm-hmm. and she had these questions, and I started thinking about it. And I thought, well, with beer, you usually try to drink it. You make it in the same vessel that you drink it from, and you're going to have some, fermentation still going on. So you're getting a carbonated beverage, which makes it more refreshing and so forth. But with wine, you generally think, well, you have a still wine. You don't, want to carbonate it except for, sparkling wine. And so, could that have been done in antiquity, and how would they go about it? Well, the Egyptians, they have a secondary fermentation hole they put into the stopper, the clay stopper, and so there's residual fermentation still going on in the bottle or in the amphora. So, they could have, closed off that hole and, even added more sugar, I suppose, of some sort, and, had a kind of carbonated, and had a carbonated beverage of sorts, but it's never talked about in the literature, so I don't know if there's any textual evidence for it or not.
Seems like it's worth researching. And Robert, you want to join in?
Yeah, I just was going to ask Dr. Pat if he thinks it's possible that we'll ever see blending of Chateau Petrus and pine bark.
I don't know. This is the whole point is if you really want to get the individual varietal flavor, the Sauterne and the Botrytis and so forth, or whatever it happens to be, with Petrus, Merlot and what have you, do you, just stick with that particular varietal to try to bring it out as much as possible under the best conditions, and since there are so many different varietals, from especially the Middle East, Turkey, Georgia, Greece, and so forth, you'd like to see more experimentation, with that gene pool, and see what the possibilities are, in and of itself, without putting an additive into it. So even Pliny the Elder, he said the best wines, were single grape wines, and if you started to have problems with the oxidation, the spoilage, then maybe you'd add the tree resin. So,
yeah. So perhaps it was Pliny the Elder then our first wine critic.
In a way, yeah. I mean, he's one of the first. But I think that the Phoenicians and other people that we've lost their writings, like Mago, the Carthaginian, probably, had lots to say on this, but we've lost their books, or it's just reported, in bits and pieces here and there.
Patrick, what future do you envision for wine, despite your expertise stemming from knowledge of the past? Clearly, you have some idea or thoughts or opinions about future directions. What future do you envision?
I just envision, just like I said before, like with the craft beer and cocktail movements, is that wine is going to, undergo, huge transformation, like it already is, as people, try out different techniques, try to, meld the ancient with the modern, and get different flavors and aromas and so forth, and that people really, because we have sensory organs that really want different differences, and of course we get sort of set in our ways sometimes, but I think that a lot of these movements now, they want to reach out and find new formulations, and so I just think that trend will continue.
Patrick, it's always a pleasure. Thank you again for your time.
Well, thank you, David.
It's been illuminating, and I appreciate both of you coming on. It's great to have an interview where I don't take the lead. So, David, I appreciate that. Dr. Pat, I would love to do this again. I think the discussion warrants continuing at some point.
Oh, sure, Robert. Thank you very much for having me on, and I enjoyed the whole discussion.
I as well. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for Wine Line Radio today.